The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut with a sound that cut through the anxious murmurs of the stunned crowd like a gunshot. Pinned hard against the scarred hood of a police cruiser was a man in a bespoke navy suit, his cheek pressed flat against the freezing metal. The arresting officer smirked at the onlookers, completely unaware that the man he was humiliating was not some ordinary troublemaker from the streets. He was weeks away from taking a seat on the United States Supreme Court. By the following afternoon, this single arrest would destroy the officer's entire life. The morning in Georgetown was crisp, the kind of sharp autumn day in Washington, D.C. that carried the scent of fallen leaves and expensive espresso. Calvin Brooks stepped out of the artisanal coffee shop on M Street with a steaming black coffee in his hand. At 58, he carried himself with a quiet, inherent dignity earned over decades of measuring every word and every step. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, an overcoat draped neatly over one arm, and a silk tie perfectly knotted at his collar. For the past 2 weeks, he had lived inside a whirlwind. As a highly respected judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, he had just been named the president's nominee to fill the vacant seat on the Supreme Court. His face had appeared on the front pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times. Yet without the sharp lighting of a television studio or the black robes of his office, to some he was simply another man walking down the street. To Officer Kenneth Foley, he was a target. Foley was a 15-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police Department, a man built entirely of rigid biases and unchecked authority. In the precinct, he had a reputation whispered about in locker rooms, but never formally challenged. He aggressively policed the city's most affluent neighborhoods, making certain that anyone who didn't belong received heavy scrutiny. For years, he had hidden his prejudice behind a badge, justifying racial profiling with the thin excuse of proactive policing. Moments earlier, the radio in Foley's cruiser had crackled with a dispatch. A burglary had occurred in a high-end townhouse 3 blocks away. The suspect description was agonizingly vague. A black male estimated to be in his late 20s, wearing dark sweatpants and a gray hooded sweatshirt, last seen fleeing on foot. Calvin Brooks was nearly 60. He wore a 3-piece suit that cost more than Foley earned in a month. He walked at a leisurely pace, sipping a macchiato. By no metric of logic, law, or common sense did he match the description of the fleeing suspect. Yet as Foley cruised down M Street, his eyes locked onto Calvin. He did not see a federal judge. He did not see a Supreme Court nominee. He saw a black man in a predominantly wealthy white neighborhood. In Foley's twisted worldview, that alone constituted reasonable suspicion. He wrenched the steering wheel hard, pulling the cruiser onto the curb with tires screeching against concrete. The sudden noise startled a flock of pigeons and drew the immediate attention of pedestrians enjoying their morning stroll. Foley threw open the door, stepped out with one hand resting heavily on his utility belt, and puffed his chest as he approached. "Hey, you there! Stop walking!" Calvin paused. He looked around, genuinely believing the officer must be speaking to someone behind him. When he realized Foley was glaring directly at him, he calmly took a sip of his coffee and turned to face the man. "Can I help you, officer?" His voice was a rich, deep baritone, the same voice that had commanded respect in federal courtrooms for more than 2 decades. There was no fear in it, only mild, polite curiosity. "I said stop walking. Put the coffee down on the hood of my car and show me your hands." Calvin's brow furrowed slightly. He was an expert in constitutional law. He knew the parameters of Terry versus Ohio the way other men knew their own names. He understood exactly what constituted an investigatory stop and what constituted a violation of the Fourth Amendment. "Officer, I am perfectly happy to speak with you," he said, voice remaining level as he lowered the coffee cup to his side. "But I'd like to know why I am being stopped. Have I committed a traffic infraction on foot?" Foley's face flushed red. He despised being questioned, especially by people he considered beneath his authority. "I don't need to explain myself to you. We have a report of a robbery in this area. You match the description of the suspect. Now put the cup down and give me your ID." Calvin sighed internally. The reality of his skin color overriding a tailored suit and graying hair was a tragedy he had faced before, though not in many years. "Officer, unless the suspect was described as a nearly 60-year-old man in a charcoal suit, I highly doubt I match the description of a fleeing burglar. Furthermore, I left my wallet in my briefcase at my office. I just stepped out for coffee. No ID." Foley's eyes narrowed into malicious slits. To him, this was the golden ticket. No identification, evasive behavior, refusal of a lawful order. "Put your hands on the hood of the car, now." The atmosphere on the street shifted dramatically. Pedestrians stopped walking. A few people pulled out smartphones, camera lenses catching the morning sun as they began to record. Calvin noticed the gathering crowd. He knew that any sudden movement, any display of anger, would be weaponized against him. "Officer," he said, voice dropping an octave and radiating absolute authority, "I am not refusing a lawful order because your order is not lawful. You lack reasonable, articulable suspicion to detain me. If you insist on pressing this matter, I strongly suggest you call your watch commander to this location." Foley scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think you're a lawyer or something? You think you can talk your way out of this? I'm the law out here." "I don't think I'm a lawyer," Calvin replied calmly. "I know exactly what I am, and I am asking you, for your own sake, to step back and assess this situation." The calmness in Calvin's voice infuriated Foley more than any amount of screaming could have. Foley wanted submission. He wanted fear. The absolute lack of intimidation in Calvin's eyes felt like an insult to the badge. Without another word, Foley lunged. He grabbed Calvin roughly by the shoulder of the expensive coat and spun him around with brute force. Calvin's coffee tumbled to the pavement, hot liquid splashing across polished leather shoes as the ceramic cup shattered. Gasps erupted from the crowd. "Hey, what are you doing to him?" a woman shouted from the patio of the coffee shop. "Get back! Police business!" Foley roared, shoving Calvin hard against the hood of the cruiser. The metal was freezing against Calvin's cheek. "Spread your legs!" Foley shouted, kicking Calvin's ankle aggressively to force his stance wider. Calvin did not resist physically, but he did not stay silent. "Officer, you are committing a false arrest. You are engaging in battery under color of law. You are violating my civil rights, and you are doing it in front of a dozen cameras." "Shut your mouth!" Foley snarled, yanking Calvin's arms behind his back with unnecessary violence. He unclipped the handcuffs. The sound was sharp in the cold air. Click, click. The cold steel bit into Calvin's wrists, tightened a fraction too much to ensure maximum discomfort. Foley patted him down aggressively and found nothing but a cell phone and a money clip holding a $50 bill. No weapons, no stolen jewelry, nothing. Yet Foley was too deep in his own pride to back down. He had made a scene, and now he had to justify it. "You're under arrest for resisting a police officer, failure to identify, and obstruction of justice," he declared loudly, ensuring the crowd heard every word. "I did not resist, and failure to identify without secondary cause in this jurisdiction is not an arrestable offense," Calvin stated, face still pressed to the hood. "You are destroying your career right now, officer." "My career is just fine, tough guy." Foley sneered, grabbing Calvin by the collar and shoving him toward the back door of the cruiser. He pressed a heavy hand on top of Calvin's head, forcing him down into the cramped back seat, then slammed the door shut with a triumphant thud. He turned to the crowd and pointed a finger. "Show's over. Move along." Inside the cruiser, Calvin sat in the claustrophobic space behind the plexiglass divider. His wrists throbbed. The smell of stale sweat and cheap vinyl filled his nose. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, controlling his heart rate. A profound aching sadness settled over him. Not for himself, but for the countless young men who looked like him, who lacked his legal knowledge and his power, and who ended up in the backs of cars like this every single day with no hope of justice. Foley climbed into the driver's seat, whistling a cheerful, off-key tune. He adjusted the rearview mirror to look at his prisoner. "You should have just shown me your ID, pal. Now you're going to spend the weekend in lockup." Calvin opened his eyes and met Foley's gaze in the mirror. His expression was as cold and unyielding as granite. "I suggest you drive to your precinct, officer," he said softly, "because when we get there, the world as you know it is going to come to a very abrupt end." The drive to the 2nd District Police Station took less than 10 minutes, but Foley spent the entire time attempting to verbally demean his passenger. He bragged about how many smart guys he had locked up, how the streets belonged to him. Calvin did not say a single word in response. He stared out the window, calculating his exact next moves. When the cruiser pulled into the precinct's rear sally port, Foley hauled Calvin out of the back seat by the arm and dragged him toward the heavy steel doors of the booking area. The station was bustling with the morning shift change. Uniformed officers drank terrible coffee from styrofoam cups. Paperwork shuffled. The low hum of police radios filled the air. Desk Sergeant William Hayes, a grizzled veteran with 30 years on the force and a strict adherence to procedure, sat behind the high wooden desk. "Look what I dragged in, Hayes," Foley announced loudly, marching Calvin into the center of the room. "Caught this one casing houses over on M Street. Matched the description of a burglary suspect. Gave me lip, refused to identify, resisted." Hayes looked up from his monitor. He studied the suspect, a man in a ruined high-end suit, standing with perfect posture, despite the cuffs behind his back. There was something intensely familiar about the man's face. Hayes narrowed his eyes as a strange sense of unease washed over him. "All right, Foley, bring him to the counter." Foley shoved Calvin forward. "Empty your pockets. Oh, wait, you can't. You're cuffed." He laughed at his own joke, reached into Calvin's coat pocket, and tossed the money clip and sleek cell phone onto the desk. "Name?" Hayes asked, looking directly at Calvin. Calvin looked up at the desk sergeant. "My name is Calvin Brooks." Hayes's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He knew that name. He had just heard it on the morning news while driving to work. He stared at Calvin's face again. The graying temples, the sharp jawline, the piercing, intelligent eyes. Suddenly the color drained entirely from Sergeant Hayes's face. His stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. He looked from Calvin to Foley, who was leaning against the counter, looking unbearably smug. "Foley," Hayes whispered, voice trembling slightly. "Where did you pick him up?" "M Street, like I said. Matched the description of the kid who broke into the townhouse." The suspect in that call was described as 25 years old, wearing a hoodie. "Foley," Hayes's voice rose in panic. "This man is wearing a suit." "He's a suspect, Hayes. Process him," Foley snapped, annoyed by the pushback. "Officer Foley." Calvin's voice cut through the noise of the precinct like a razor blade. The entire room seemed to quiet as the deep, commanding tone seized everyone's attention. "You arrested me without probable cause. You assaulted me. You deprived me of my liberty under the color of law. Sergeant, I would like my phone. I have to make a call." "You don't get a phone call until you're processed," Foley yelled, stepping toward Calvin. "Step back, Foley," Hayes barked, standing so fast his chair rolled and slammed against the back wall. The sudden aggression from the desk sergeant shocked the entire room into absolute silence. Every officer turned to look. Hayes reached over the counter with shaking hands, grabbed Calvin's phone, and gently placed it near Calvin's hands. "Sir, Judge Brooks, I am so sorry." Foley froze, his mind short-circuited. "Judge, what are you talking about? Hayes, he's a perp." Hayes ignored him completely. He rushed out from behind the desk, pulling a set of handcuff keys from his belt. "Turn around, Your Honor, please." "Wait, Hayes, what are you doing?" Foley shouted, stepping forward. "Shut up, Foley!" Hayes roared, face red with terror. "Shut your damn mouth before you make this any worse." Hayes unlocked the cuffs. The heavy metal fell away. Calvin slowly brought his arms forward, rubbing his wrists where deep red indentations had formed. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, then picked up his phone from the desk. Foley stared in disbelief. "Hayes, what the hell is going on?" A younger officer near the back of the room, who had been staring at his phone, suddenly stood up. "Holy hell, Officer Foley. That's the president's nominee for the Supreme Court. It's Calvin Brooks. He's a federal judge." The silence in the room became suffocating. It was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Foley's smug expression dissolved, replaced by a pale, sickening horror. His eyes darted from Calvin to Hayes, and back again. The reality of what he had done crashed into him with the force of a freight train. He hadn't just profiled a random citizen. He had brutally arrested one of the most powerful legal figures in the United States of America. Calvin didn't look at Foley. He calmly unlocked his phone and dialed a number. He put the phone to his ear, eyes finally locking onto Foley's terrified face. "Yes, it's Brooks," he said into the phone, voice echoing in the dead silence of the police station. "I need you to contact the Department of Justice, the FBI Civil Rights Division, and the mayor's office. Tell them I am currently at the 2nd District Precinct." He paused, eyes narrowing as he looked directly through Officer Foley's soul. "Tell them I was just arrested, and tell them I am pressing federal charges." The precinct was a vacuum of sound, save for the ragged, uneven breathing of Officer Kenneth Foley. The words "federal charges" hung in the stale air like a guillotine waiting to drop. Calvin Brooks ended the call and placed his phone deliberately on the wooden counter. He did not yell. He did not gloat. He simply stood there, a man whose tailored charcoal suit was stained with spilled coffee and wrinkled from the brutal treatment against a police cruiser, radiating a terrifying, absolute authority. Sergeant William Hayes was sweating profusely, hands trembling as he shoved the handcuff keys back into his belt. "Your Honor, can I get you a chair, some water, a medic?" "I require nothing from you, Sergeant, other than the preservation of all surveillance and body camera footage from the last 45 minutes, Calvin replied, voice chillingly calm. "I suggest you secure it immediately." Foley, who had been paralyzed by shock, suddenly snapped into a frantic, animalistic state of self-preservation. His mind, usually slow and clouded by arrogance, raced with terrifying clarity. He knew protocol. He knew how the system worked. If the body camera footage and the cruiser's dash cam video made it into the hands of the FBI, his career was over. If they proved he had no probable cause, he wouldn't just be fired. He would be federally indicted for civil rights violations. "Hayes, wait!" Foley stammered, stepping toward the desk, face a mask of desperate panic. "Look, we can fix this. I made a mistake. A bad ID. It happens. Let me just go write up the release paperwork. No harm, no foul, right? Judge, a misunderstanding." Calvin slowly turned his head to look at Foley. The look in the judge's eyes was so utterly devoid of sympathy that Foley took an involuntary step backward. "There is no we, Officer Foley," Calvin said, enunciating every syllable. And this was not a misunderstanding. This was the arrogant application of unchecked power. You saw a black man in a wealthy neighborhood and decided the Constitution did not apply. You are not writing any paperwork. You are going to stand right there until the authorities arrive. But Foley couldn't stand there. The walls were closing in. He backed away toward the rear hallway, leading to the precinct server and evidence rooms. I need to use the restroom," he muttered, turning and practically sprinting down the corridor. Hayes reached for his radio. "Foley, get back here!" But Foley was already gone. He burst through the swinging doors of the locker room, bypassing the restrooms entirely, and headed straight for the tech hub where the Axon body camera docks were located. His hands shook violently as he unclipped the camera from his chest. He knew the footage automatically uploaded to the cloud once docked, but there was a brief window where a commanding officer, or someone with the right administrative password, could flag a video as accidental recording or training and permanently delete it before the sync completed. Foley had watched his former shift lieutenant do it 2 years earlier to cover up an excessive force complaint. He had memorized the override password. He slammed the camera into the docking bay. The green light began to blink, indicating the sync had started. Foley threw himself into the rolling chair in front of the administrative terminal, thick fingers aggressively hammering the keyboard. He typed in the lieutenant's old credentials. Access granted. Sweat dripped from Foley's nose onto the keyboard. He navigated to the active uploads folder, frantically searching for his badge number. There it was, a 12-minute video file. The file that contained him assaulting a federal judge and Supreme Court nominee. His cursor hovered over the delete file icon. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. All he had to do was click it. It wouldn't save him completely. There were civilian cell phones out there, but it would destroy the crisp, high-definition audio and video from his own chest that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Calvin had never resisted. He pressed his finger down on the mouse. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Foley gasped, spinning around in the chair. Standing in the doorway of the tech room was Captain Richard Montgomery, the precinct commander. Montgomery was a hard-nosed, strictly-by-the-book leader who had been in his office upstairs when the chaotic murmurs from the bullpen reached him. Next to Montgomery stood 2 men in immaculate dark suits, their FBI badges already clipped to their belts. "Captain," Foley choked out, hand flying off the mouse as if it had caught fire. I was logging my evidence." "Step away from the terminal, Officer Foley," Captain Montgomery ordered, voice laced with a lethal mixture of fury and disgust. Special Agent Lawrence Maddox, a senior investigator with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, stepped into the room. The response time had been practically instantaneous. When a federal judge slated for the highest court in the land makes a distress call, the full weight of the federal government moves at lightning speed. Maddox walked past Foley without even looking at him, glancing at the computer monitor. "He was in the administrative deletion menu, Captain, attempting to destroy evidence of a federal crime." Montgomery closed his eyes for a brief second, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He had spent 10 years trying to clean up the reputation of the 2nd District, and in 15 minutes, Kenneth Foley had just burned it to the ground. "Officer Kenneth Foley," Captain Montgomery said, voice dropping into an icy register, "you are hereby stripped of your police powers effective immediately. Surrender your weapon, your badge, and your radio." "Captain, please," Foley begged, voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "It was a mistake. He matched the description. You know me. I'm a good cop. I was just being proactive." "You arrested Judge Calvin Brooks, you absolute imbecile," Montgomery shouted, finally losing his composure, voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You assaulted the president's nominee for the United States Supreme Court, and then you came back here to destroy federal evidence. Hand over your weapon, or these agents will put you on the floor and take it from you." Trembling, Foley unholstered his service weapon and placed it on the desk. He unpinned his badge, the badge he had hidden behind for 15 years, and set it next to the gun. Special Agent Maddox pulled a pair of heavy federal handcuffs from his belt. "Kenneth Foley, you are under arrest for the deprivation of rights under color of law and tampering with evidence in a federal investigation. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." As the cold steel clicked around Foley's wrists, a brutal, poetic reversal of the morning's events, he realized with sickening clarity that there was no union rep, no sympathetic judge, and no blue wall of silence that could save him now. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, the world had exploded. The cell phone video recorded by the woman at the coffee shop had been uploaded to social media. Within 30 minutes, it had 1 million views. Within an hour, it was playing on a continuous loop on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. The visual was devastating. Calvin Brooks, a man of impeccable character, standing calmly in his tailored suit while being violently shoved against a police cruiser by a red-faced, screaming officer. The audio of Calvin warning Foley that he was committing a false arrest, followed by Foley's arrogant, dismissive sneer, sent shockwaves through the nation. At the White House, the press secretary held an emergency briefing, condemning the arrest in the strongest possible terms and confirming that the president had spoken with Judge Brooks to offer his full support. But the true storm was brewing at Metropolitan Police Headquarters. Mayor Eleanor Preston and Police Chief Gregory Lawson stood behind a podium in a room packed with screaming reporters. The flashbulbs were blinding. Chief Lawson, sweating under the intense lights, gripped the edges of the podium. The actions taken by former Officer Kenneth Foley do not represent the values of this department, he stated, reading from a hastily prepared statement. Foley has been terminated effective immediately, and we are cooperating fully with the Department of Justice in their criminal investigation. Chief Lawson, a reporter from the Washington Post shouted over the din. Officer Foley had 14 excessive force complaints on his record prior to today. Why was he still on the streets patrolling? Lawson swallowed hard. Those complaints were investigated internally, and at the time were deemed inconclusive. Because the victims didn't have the power of a federal judge to fight back, another reporter fired back. Meanwhile, inside a bleak interrogation room at the FBI's Washington field office, Kenneth Foley sat across from his union representative, Michael Harrigan. Foley was in an orange holding jumper, his arrogance entirely evaporated, replaced by the terrified realization of a man staring down a decade in federal prison. "Mike, you got to help me," Foley pleaded, leaning over the metal table. "The union has a defense fund. We can spin this. We can say I was hyper-focused on the burglary call. Tunnel vision. It's a recognized psychological phenomenon in high-stress policing." Harrigan, a veteran cop who usually fought tooth and nail for his members, just stared at Foley with a mixture of pity and utter contempt. He slowly closed his legal pad. "Ken, I'm here as a courtesy. That's it." "What do you mean?" Foley demanded, panic rising in his throat. "I mean the Fraternal Order of Police is not funding your defense," Harrigan said, voice cold. "I mean I got off the phone with the union president 10 minutes ago. We are publicly disavowing you. You didn't just cross the line, Ken. You assaulted a federal judge on camera and then tried to delete the evidence while the FBI was in the building. You are radioactive. You are entirely on your own." Foley slumped back in his chair, the oxygen leaving his lungs. "They can't do that. I pay my dues. Your career is over, Ken. The only question now is how much of your life you're going to spend at Leavenworth." Harrigan stood up and walked out of the room, letting the heavy steel door slam shut, leaving Foley in total isolation. While Foley sat in a cell, Calvin Brooks was holding court of a different kind. He had returned to his private chambers at the federal courthouse and changed into a fresh suit. Sitting across from him was Sarah Jenkins, one of the most ruthless and brilliant civil rights attorneys in the country. "The mayor's office just called, offering a massive, quiet settlement," Sarah said, scrolling through her phone. "7 figures. They want you to sign an NDA and make this go away before your confirmation hearings begin next week. They're terrified this is going to turn into a referendum on systemic policing issues." Calvin stood up and walked over to his large window, looking out over the Capitol building. His wrists still ached from the handcuffs. He thought about the cold hood of the car. He thought about Foley's eyes. The absolute certainty Foley had that he could abuse a black man in broad daylight and face 0 consequences. "We are not settling," Calvin said, deep voice resolute. "Calvin, you have confirmation hearings. The opposition might use a messy civil lawsuit to paint you as an activist judge," Sarah warned gently. "I am perfectly fine with that." Calvin turned to face her, eyes blazing with fierce, unwavering justice. "Foley's union representative just abandoned him. He's going to face federal criminal charges for what he did to me. But I am not the first person he has done this to. I am just the first one he couldn't silence." Sarah smiled slightly, recognizing the tone. What do you want to do, Your Honor? I want you to file a massive civil rights lawsuit against Kenneth Foley and the Metropolitan Police Department, Calvin instructed. But we are not suing for money. We are suing for records. I want you to subpoena every single arrest report, field interview, and use of force incident Foley has filed in the last 15 years. Sarah's eyes widened. You're going to audit his entire career. Exactly, Calvin said softly. Every young man he illegally searched, every piece of evidence he planted, every false report he wrote to cover up his violence. The system protected him because his victims were voiceless. But they have my voice now. We are going to find every single person Kenneth Foley has falsely convicted, and we are going to tear his legacy down to the studs. The war room inside the offices of Jenkins and Associates was a sprawling masterpiece of organized chaos. Whiteboards lined the glass walls, covered in complex flowcharts connecting dates, names, badge numbers, and court docket files. Boxes of heavily redacted police reports secured through emergency federal subpoenas were stacked shoulder-high in the corners. The air smelled of stale coffee, laser printer toner, and the electric hum of a dozen paralegals working around the clock. Sarah Jenkins stood at the head of the long conference table, eyes scanning a projected spreadsheet. Calvin Brooks sat quietly at the opposite end. Despite the fact that his Supreme Court confirmation hearings were scheduled to begin in less than 5 days, he spent every spare evening in this room. Foley didn't just have a pattern, Your Honor, Sarah said, dropping a thick manila folder onto the table. He had a hunting ground. Over the last 15 years, Foley made 412 arrests. 78% of those were young black men. But here's where it goes from racist policing to a criminal enterprise. In over 200 of those cases, the primary charge was resisting arrest or failure to comply, with no underlying secondary crime. Calvin leaned forward, hands clasped, face a mask of solemn concentration. He used the badge to initiate the confrontation. When they questioned him, he assaulted them and charged them with resisting. Exactly, Sarah nodded, pulling a photograph from the file and sliding it down the polished wood of the table. They were mostly kids who couldn't afford private counsel. They were assigned overworked public defenders who looked at Foley's polished testimony and told their clients to take a plea deal to avoid jail time. But taking a plea meant acquiring a felony record. Foley ruined lives systematically and deliberately. But this one is the linchpin. Calvin picked up the photograph. It was a mugshot of a young man with terrified eyes and a bruised cheekbone. His name is Donovan Pierce, Sarah explained softly. 5 years ago, Donovan was a 19-year-old sophomore at Georgetown University on a full academic scholarship. He was walking home from a study group at midnight. Foley stopped him, claimed Donovan matched the description of a car thief. When Donovan asked to call his parents, Foley beat him with a baton, charged him with assault on a police officer, and threw him in lockup. Calvin stared at the young man's bruised face. The echoes of his own arrest rang loudly in his mind. What happened to him? Foley lied on the stand. He claimed Donovan took a swing at him. The jury believed the veteran cop over the scared college kid. Sarah's voice tightened with anger. Donovan was convicted. He lost his scholarship. He was expelled from Georgetown. He served 18 months in a state penitentiary. He works the night shift at a warehouse now, trying to pay off court fees. Calvin closed his eyes. The weight of the injustice felt suffocating. He had the power, the money, and the prestige to fight back. Donovan Pierce had had nothing. I want to meet him, Sarah. Bring him here tomorrow. While Calvin was unearthing the ghosts of Precinct 2, Kenneth Foley was entirely consumed by the nightmare his life had become. He was currently housed in the Alexandria Adult Detention Center under federal hold, segregated from the general population for his own safety. His cell was a 6x8 concrete box. There were no windows to the outside world, only a small slit of reinforced glass looking out into a sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor. For the first few days, Foley had paced the cell like a caged animal, fueled by a toxic mixture of rage and denial. He yelled at the guards, demanding phone calls, threatening them with union retaliation, screaming that he was a decorated officer. But as the days turned into a week, the suffocating reality began to crush his chest. No one from the union came. No fellow officers slipped him contraband or offered a sympathetic nod. He was a pariah. The final breaking point occurred on a Tuesday afternoon when his court-appointed defense attorney, a weary man named Wallace, came to visit him in the secure visitation room. Foley sat behind the plexiglass, orange jumpsuit hanging loosely over his frame. He had lost weight. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone, replaced by the twitching paranoia of a trapped rat. "Wallace, listen to me," Foley begged, picking up the heavy black telephone receiver. "You have to get me bail. I can't stay in here. The guards look at me like I'm dead meat. I'm a cop. You know what happens to cops in here." Wallace sighed, adjusting his glasses. He looked at Foley not with malice, but with cold professional detachment. "There is no bail, Ken. The federal magistrate deemed you a flight risk and a danger to the community. But that is the least of your problems." "What do you mean?" Foley's voice cracked. "Your wife filed for divorce yesterday," Wallace said plainly. "She's taking the kids and moving to her sister's house in Ohio. Furthermore, the civil rights lawsuit filed by Judge Brooks's legal team has triggered an asset freeze. The bank has frozen your pension, your savings, and the equity on your house pending the outcome of the civil trial." Foley dropped the receiver from his ear, staring at Wallace through the smudged glass. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His chest heaved as a cold, terrifying void opened up beneath him. "Ken, pick up the phone," Wallace ordered through the speaker. Slowly, with a trembling hand, Foley brought the receiver back to his ear. "The Department of Justice is offering a plea deal," Wallace continued, tone flat. "If you plead guilty to the deprivation of civil rights under color of law and the destruction of federal evidence, they will recommend 84 months in federal prison, 7 years. 7 years, Foley whispered, tears finally spilling over his eyelids and tracking down his unshaven cheeks. "I'll die in there. I'll be killed. You have to fight this. Take it to trial." "If we take it to trial, Ken, they aren't just bringing the Brooks tape," Wallace warned, leaning closer to the glass. "They have subpoenaed your entire career. The DOJ has reopened 62 of your past arrests. They are going to parade a dozen young men you put in the hospital in front of a federal jury. If you lose at trial, the judge will give you 20 years. Take the 7. It's the only mercy you're going to get." Foley hung his head, burying his face in his hands, weeping uncontrollably. The badge that had been his shield, his sword, and his entire identity was gone. He was nothing now but a prisoner in the very system he had abused for over a decade. Back at the law firm, Calvin Brooks sat across from Donovan Pierce. Donovan was 24 now, but he looked much older. His posture was defensive, his eyes guarded. He wore a faded flannel shirt and work boots, sitting awkwardly in the plush leather chair of the conference room. "Mr. Pierce," Calvin began gently, "I want to thank you for coming in to speak with me." Donovan looked at the older man, still grappling with the surreal nature of the meeting. "You're the judge from the news, the one Foley arrested." "I am," Calvin nodded. "Why do you care about me?" Donovan asked, voice laced with years of built-up cynicism and pain. "When I told the judge what Foley did to me, they laughed. They called me a thug. Now that it happened to a guy in a fancy suit, suddenly everyone cares. It's too late for me. I'm a felon. I sweep floors. Weep." Calvin did not flinch at the anger. He embraced it, understanding exactly where it came from. "You are absolutely right, Donovan. It is a tragedy and a profound failure of the justice system that it took my arrest to shine a light on this precinct. I cannot give you back the 5 years that were stolen from you. I cannot give you back your nights in that cell. He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees, looking directly into Donovan's guarded eyes. "But I can promise you this. I am going to tear Kenneth Foley's life down to the foundation. And when I am done, I am going to use the full weight of this lawsuit and the Department of Justice to clear your name. We are going to have your conviction vacated. We are going to expunge your record. You are going to get your life back." For the first time in 5 years, the heavy defensive wall behind Donovan's eyes cracked. A single tear rolled down his cheek. He looked down at his rough, calloused hands, overwhelmed by the promise of salvation he had long ago stopped praying for. The marble columns of the Hart Senate office building stood as silent sentinels over the packed hearing room. The confirmation hearings for Judge Calvin Brooks had become the most watched political event of the decade. The room was blindingly bright, illuminated by the massive floodlights of the television networks. Calvin sat alone at the witness table, dressed in an immaculate black suit. He looked serene, a man entirely in his element. Behind him sat his family, and just a few rows back, watching intently, sat Donovan Pierce, wearing a new suit purchased by Sarah Jenkins. For 2 days, Calvin had masterfully answered complex legal questions regarding antitrust laws, First Amendment jurisprudence, and interstate commerce. He was brilliant, unshakable, and commanded the respect of almost every senator in the room. But politics was a vicious game, and on the third day, the opposition made its move. Senator Thomas Reynolds, a staunch partisan known for his aggressive questioning, leaned into his microphone. "Judge Brooks," he began, tone dripping with skepticism, "I want to talk about your temperament. Last month you were involved in an altercation with local law enforcement. Since then you have launched a massive, multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit against the police department, effectively crippling their precinct, and you have actively lobbied the DOJ to prosecute the arresting officer. Many of my constituents are asking, if you are confirmed to the highest court in the land, will you be a neutral arbiter of the law, or will you use your seat to pursue personal vendettas against law enforcement?" The room went dead silent. The cameras zoomed in tightly on Calvin's face. He did not show a flash of anger. He did not look defensive. He simply adjusted the microphone in front of him and looked directly at Senator Reynolds with a gaze that could cut through steel. "Senator," Calvin's deep voice resonated through the massive speakers, echoing off the marble walls. "A vendetta is an act of personal revenge. Justice is the pursuit of systemic accountability. The officer who arrested me did not just make a procedural error. He violated my Fourth Amendment rights. He committed battery, and he attempted to destroy federal evidence to cover his tracks." Calvin paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "But this lawsuit is not about me, Senator. It is about the 212 individuals, many of whom didn't have my resources, my legal education, or my platform, who were brutally victimized by that same officer over a 15-year period while the system looked the other way. I survived my encounter with that officer because I am a federal judge. But the Constitution does not exist only to protect federal judges. It exists to protect the 19-year-old college student walking home at midnight. It exists to protect the voiceless." He gestured slightly toward the gallery behind him without turning around. "If holding a corrupt official accountable for destroying the lives of innocent American citizens is considered a vendetta by your constituents, Senator, then I suggest they re-examine their definition of the rule of law. If I am confirmed to the Supreme Court, my allegiance will be to the Constitution of the United States, and the Constitution demands equal protection under the law, not just for those in tailored suits, but for everyone." The hearing room erupted. Applause, completely against Senate protocol, broke out from the gallery. Even a few senators on the committee could be seen nodding in quiet reverence. Senator Reynolds sat back in his leather chair, thoroughly defeated, face flushed red. He had tried to corner a lion and had been devoured on national television. 3 weeks later, Calvin Brooks was confirmed to the United States Supreme Court by a sweeping bipartisan majority. But the final act of the drama did not take place in the Supreme Court building. It took place in a windowless federal courtroom in Alexandria, Virginia. Kenneth Foley stood before the bench wearing the shapeless orange jumpsuit of a federal inmate. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains. He looked broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant bully who had strutted down M Street months earlier. Presiding over the sentencing was Judge Samuel Bennett, a stern, no-nonsense jurist who had zero tolerance for police corruption. Foley had taken the plea deal. The trial had been avoided, but the sentencing phase allowed the judge to hear victim impact statements. For 2 hours, Foley was forced to stand in his chains and look into the eyes of the young men he had brutalized. He had to listen to mothers cry about how their sons lost their jobs, their freedom, and their dignity because of his lies. Donovan Pierce had been the last to speak. He didn't yell. He simply looked Foley in the eye and said, "You took 5 years of my life because you thought I was nothing, but you're the one in chains today, and I am free." Judge Bennett looked down at Foley from the high bench. Kenneth Foley. His voice was cold and unforgiving. Law enforcement officers are entrusted with the extraordinary power to deprive citizens of their liberty. It is a sacred trust. You took that trust and twisted it into a weapon of malice, racism, and ego. You preyed on the vulnerable to inflate your own pathetic sense of authority. And when you finally targeted a man who could fight back, you behaved like a coward, attempting to destroy the evidence of your crimes. Foley squeezed his eyes shut, tears leaking down his face. "The government has recommended a sentence of 84 months, Judge Bennett continued. "I reject that recommendation. I find it vastly insufficient for the decades of generational trauma you have inflicted upon this community." Foley's eyes snapped open in sheer terror. His attorney Wallace turned pale. "Kenneth Foley, I sentence you to 144 months, 12 years, in a maximum security federal penitentiary." Judge Bennett slammed his gavel down. The crack echoed like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. "You will serve every single day of that sentence without the possibility of early parole. Officers, take this disgrace out of my courtroom." Foley's knees buckled. He collapsed, wailing in despair, heavy chains rattling loudly against the wooden floor. "No, please, Judge, please, I'll die in there." 2 massive federal marshals grabbed Foley by the armpits and dragged his sobbing, limp body backward down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy wooden double doors swung open, swallowed him into the dark hallway, and slammed shut behind him. The monster of Precinct 2 was gone forever. 6 months later, the sun shone brightly over the steps of the United States Supreme Court. Justice Calvin Brooks stood in his flowing black robes, looking out over the majestic marble plaza. The civil lawsuit had concluded. The Metropolitan Police Department had been placed under a federal consent decree, forcing sweeping historic reforms in their oversight, training, and use of force protocols. More importantly, the Department of Justice, armed with the evidence uncovered by Sarah Jenkins, had successfully vacated the convictions of over 150 individuals wrongfully arrested by Foley. Donovan Pierce was one of them. With his record expunged and a substantial financial settlement from the city, Donovan had re-enrolled at Georgetown University. He was studying pre-law. Calvin took a deep breath of the crisp Washington air. He felt the heavy, immense weight of the robes on his shoulders. He knew that the fight for justice was never truly over. There would always be men like Foley hiding behind badges and gavels, attempting to bend the law to their own prejudice. But as long as there were people willing to stand up, willing to endure the cold steel of the handcuffs to expose the darkness, the scales of justice would ultimately find their balance. Calvin turned away from the plaza and walked back into the grand halls of the court, ready to do the work. Justice isn't given. It is fought for. The arrogance of one corrupt officer met the unyielding brilliance of a man who refused to be broken, sparking a movement that shattered a system of abuse and freed the innocent. Justice Calvin Brooks proved that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds the light.